someone to pick them out. Just thank you. The words that have been generated, and when I look at the front row every night at the people you bring and what you have given us is simply astonishing. And thank you, thank you.
Well, I'm starting a new week, and so I will remind the few people that weren't here last week that following these events, Monday through Friday night, we have a reception across the way in the spa in the basement of Case College Center. And if you haven't turned off your cell phones, if you would do that, this is my regular routine. Thank you. This evening, I'll introduce Andrea Barrett, and then after Andrea's reading, Victoria Riddell will introduce Carolyn Forche. Okay. There is a fugitive lyricism in the fictions of Andrea Barrett. Though Andrea has often staked the claim to writing transparent and austere, the beauties of her disciplined, unostentatious prose are readily apparent. How not to savor the music of a casual observation like this one? The building was so quiet that from her window she could hear the tips of the eelgrass brushing against the sand. Or this observation of a bucket of jellyfish. The other bucket glittered wildly, the sun refracting off the trailing ribbons of the pleurobrachia and the tiny fringed combs on the idia, which were darting back and forth, waves of color, pink, then purple, then yellow, then green, pink again, pinker still. Nothing dry or withholding there. No recoil from the accent of sensory submersion. From such controlled passages, Andrea coaxes a texture open to every prospect of sensation. For all of its dramatic sinew and intellectuality, Andrea's work is also rich in color, however resistant it is to rhetorical excess and dreamy imprecision. Of course, Andrea has long been identified as a writer with a profound interest in the natural world. Often her fiction is saturated with references to coral reefs and barnacles and natural selection and soil formation. Her works are characteristically built around what seem like subjects, not all of them apparently promising. Subjects like map making, epidemic prevention, genetic discoveries, early cures for tuberculosis. How does it feel, she wonders in her work, to lose part of your hand to X-ray experiments, or part of your nose to Arctic exploration? These subjects and concerns, moreover, are as much a part of her shorter fictions as of her novels. Remarkable, some readers would say, that a fictionist would devote herself to exploring subjects such as these, not occasionally, but persistently. On more than one occasion, Andrea has wondered when it became the expectation, that's her word, that American writing would be content-free and focus more or less entirely on the movement of consciousness or on the intimate dramas of love and family that are not felt to belong, not in the same way, to the domain of content. Especially women writers Andrea has observed, are typically expected to be absorbed primarily with intimate matters of the heart and with what one writer calls the soft metaphysics of consciousness itself. But then it is a mistake to think about the options in this way as a choice between an appropriate domain of intimacy and consciousness on the one hand, and an alternative domain not really promising for an ambitious writer. The problem clearly is in the tendency to think of these as separate either-or options. For one thing, there is in Andrea's work a perfect balance struck between internal and external worlds. Her characters, often scientists or apprentice scientists, are typically thoughtful people preoccupied not simply with the overmastering task or danger at hand, but with their own fitness for the task, the source of their own urgent obsessions, the human perils and personal sacrifices they must make to proceed. These characters are not ciphers. They are not interchangeable or disposable. They are endowed with many different kinds of consciousness and anxiety. We care about them not because we are invested principally in their scientific projects, however fascinating these are made to seem in Andrea's hands. We care because the characters have complex inner lives, and because, however deftly Andrea takes us into those lives, she understands, and she helps us to understand, that in the end, character and consciousness are everything that cannot quite be encompassed. For all of Andrea's commitment to scientific inquiry and knowledge, her greater commitment is to the mysteries that we know we can never fully settle. So that really to speak of Andrea principally as a writer with subjects to explore, a writer with an agenda, is not quite to see how beautifully she refuses ever to be tyrannized by her subjects and remains always and only the servant of her own fertile imagination. Andrea Barrett.
I'm flabbergasted, as always, by your introduction. Thank you for that. I never recognize myself in what you say, but I feel so honored to have your brain at work on what I do. And speaking of subjects that might seem to be less than promising at first glance, that was really very funny. And very true. Why am I drawn to this stuff? The last time I was here, I read from a long story called The Island, which Bob was kind enough to publish in Salmagundi, and which included those squirmy little pleurobrachia in their tub. I've been working since then on several more long stories, which maybe will come together, or maybe won't, into something someday. I'm going to read tonight the opening pages of one that's called The Ether of Space, and it came out in Tin House earlier this year. I'm just going to start laughing as I read it now because it's so unpromising as a subject. I can't even read the first sentence. Okay, no, seriously. Here we go. Okay. There was a lot of chit-chat to start. Some the usual, Owen's health, the weather in London, a tactful acknowledgement of the 10th anniversary of Michael's death, but some not. Owen's sister was heading to Russia with a group of Quaker relief workers. His paper on variable stars would be published in the spring. But where was the crucial news? Across the ocean, at her desk in the bedroom of her parents' house in Philadelphia, Phoebe Cornelius scanned the pages of her friend's letter impatiently. Last March, after the fighting had stopped, some British astronomers had quickly organized an expedition to view the eclipse. At 2 different stations along the path of totality, despite clouds in the Gulf of Guinea and a distorted mirror in Brazil, they'd photographed stars in the neighborhood of the sun. The results had been presented in November at a meeting in London that Phoebe had been in no position to attend, And since then, nearly 2 months, it was already January, not just a new year, but a whole new decade. She'd been waiting for Owen to supplement the sketchy, sensational newspaper articles with some first-hand observations. We were all squeezed into the meeting room at Burlington House. The pews were packed and there were people standing behind the last row and in the anteroom. The usual eminences from the Royal Society and the Astronomical Society, J.J. Thomson, Fowler, Lodge, Silberstein, etc., but also the philosopher Whitehead, several reporters, and many I didn't recognize. About 150 of us. So many the room was steaming despite the wintry day. Dyson spoke first, summarizing the work of the expeditions and then describing the photographs in the most enthusiastic terms, despite the lack of data. He claimed there was no doubt that they confirmed Einstein's prediction. The sun's gravitational field had been shown to bend the rays of starlight in accordance with his law of gravitation. But Dyson's words don't really explain it. It was more the tone, the feeling in the room. I wish you'd been there. Half of us sighing as the other half gasped, some thrilled and some appalled, and some split between the two. The older members were really upset. I could feel, I'm not sure what that was, something that shook me. I took notes as fast as I could, trying to get not only the Astronomer Royal's tabulated values, but Dr. Crommelin's description of conditions in Brazil during the eclipse, and Professor Eddington's comments on the difficult weather. I noticed that Eddington had discarded many observations, but we'll see what's really there when the full report is published a few months from now. I do believe that Einstein's theory is correct, but I'm not sure these results support it as definitively as they're claiming. The report on the meeting in the next day's Times was typically muddled regarding the mathematics and said nothing, after these years of denouncing all things German, about the oddity of celebrating the work of a German scientist. In fact, an article on the same page announced the King's call for 2 minutes of silence during the anniversary of the signing of the armistice. I went with my sister to the cenotaph that day, and when 11 struck and the guns went off, the crowd fell silent. The traffic stopped too, and the trains and the tube. People stood still in the shops, stood up at their desks. I wept like everyone else, and for an instant thought, I have never seen anything like this. Although later I realized that at Burlington House, I'd had a similar sense of being present at a, what do you call these? A discontinuity, a rift? In one case torn by grief, and in the other by wonder. For some, the meeting itself was a kind of grief. In the midst of the questions, Sir Oliver Lodge stood up abruptly and rushed out without a word. Later, he told a reporter he'd left to catch a train, but some of the younger men had been a bit cruel, the old man running from the new theory, and so forth. Not easy at that age, I imagine, to find that the world has just become a different place. I have forgotten to thank you for your report on the Washington meeting, and to say that I read your draft chapter on the evolution of the stars with real interest. I hope the book is coming along wonderfully, and that you and Sam are both well. An actual report, finally, from an actual witness. How pleasing to glimpse a scrap of reality. The articles in the New York Times, based on cables sent from London, had been as muddled as those Owen described. Men of science, more or less agog. Indeed. Lights all askew in the heavens. The articles trumpeted the impossibility of understanding the theory, while at the same time suggesting that it had changed the world. Phoebe rose from her desk, went downstairs, and stepped outside to look at the sky. 9 o'clock and freezing cold, the moon 2 days past new, the stars giving no sign that they were not as they'd once seemed. The sound of her father's viola waved down from the top of the house, bits of Bach easing through the old glass in the attic windows, spreading from her mother's garden, where in summer the peonies flourished as if fertilized by the sound, through the tiny backyard to the neighbors on all sides. Always her father played at night, retreating from what to him was a world in which everything, business, politics, music, art, grew steadily worse. Yet the house hadn't crumbled around them. The house in which he and then Phoebe had grown up looked the same. So too, she checked again, did the stars above. Where you lived and what you knew determined what you expected to see. Once the moon was a smooth, glowing orb, and then it had mountains and seas. Once Jupiter wandered alone, and then he had moons. Once orbits were round, and the stars stayed still in space. In earlier books, she'd traced those changing perceptions. Now she was trying to write about the universe beyond the solar system. Who first thought those glowing specks were other suns like ours, or that some were island universes far beyond the Milky Way? Back in the dining room, her mother sat at one end of the table, doing something with a heap of cloth, while Sam at the other end frowned over his homework. Phoebe stopped in the doorway, next to the long crack that might have appeared to a stranger as part of the molding's design, but which in fact had been made when Sam, in a fit of temper after they'd first moved here, had hurled his suitcase at the wood. "I had a letter today from London," she told her mother. "Michael's old student, Owen." "Do these look the same length to you?" her mother asked, holding up 2 white strips. "She's been cutting out sleeves for shirts to send overseas," Sam explained without raising his head. He turned the pages of a small notebook and with his pencil added a tiny number to a column. "Homework?" Phoebe asked her son. "Look up," she thought. "Talk to me." "Sort of," he said. If she moved his way, she knew. He'd smile and close the notebook, say good night, and a minute later disappear into his room. Door closed behind him, books closed on his shelves. Body, he'd suddenly sprouted 6 inches, and his hair had darkened to Michael's shade, concealed beneath long sleeves and long pants. Instead of reaching for her secretive boy, she hung back and watched her mother shuffle paper patterns, pins and chalk, and a formidable pair of scissors. "Russia?" she asked. "Owen said his sister is headed there with another relief committee." "Germany," her mother said. "Suzanne's doing the collars and Lila's working on the cuffs. We'll start piecing them together next week." What else did he have to say? Briefly, Phoebe explained the meeting in London and the results that Owen had described. Sam's pencil ticked down the numbers, while her mother's scissors yawned and then snapped through the middle of a word. "That sounds important," her mother said. "It is," Phoebe said. "I need to understand it better for a chapter in the new book. In fact—" "Of course," her mother said, snipping away. "Don't let us interrupt you." Back at her desk, back in her room, centered in the house like a plum in a dumpling. Her father above and her mother and Sam below. Sam, who for a couple of years after Michael's death had clung so closely that sometimes, if she stopped or turned quickly, she'd trip over him. He liked to balance on a footstool, one hand on her thigh and the other on the frame of the large painting hanging in their tiny rented house in Washington. "Tell me," he'd demand, until she pointed out the figures that her great-uncle, Copernicus Wells, had painted on Pikes Peak during the eclipse of 1878. Then she'd name the instruments: telescope, spectroscope. Your father had fancier versions of those. And finally note the flaring corona and the coincidence of her being born far away on that exact day. Copernicus had given her father the painting, which her father had given to her. "Just after you were born," she'd add, pushing away the memory of Michael gazing at his new son, eyes wide beneath his reddish gold brows. "When you're grown up, I'll give it to you." Adrift in Washington then, with no idea how to continue her life, she'd imagined that she and Sam would always be close, and that when he was older she'd tell him how that painting, along with her love for mathematics, had helped steer her toward astronomy. How her father had bought her a telescope when she was 12, while her mother, who came from a Quaker family with a long tradition of learned women, had encouraged her studies. Surely Sam would want to know what she'd done before he was born. She'd imagined telling him about her time at Cornell, where she'd been drawn not to the patient collection of data, nor to speculations about the nature of the universe, but instead to the long, complicated, orderly calculations of celestial mechanics. An observant professor had steered her toward a job as a computer at the National Almanac office in Washington, where she'd briefly imagined that she might be promoted. Instead, she'd met Michael Cornelius, an astronomer with the Smithsonian. "We fell in love," she told Sam beneath the painting. A phrase that usefully hid everything from the feel of Michael's leg against her own to the smell of his hair warmed by the bedside candle. "We got married, and your father always appreciated the work I did. I kept my job until you were born. I helped him with his papers." Sam, not quite 4 when Michael died, claimed to remember his father's instruments and the scarred wooden desk where he'd bent over maps of the sky, but not Phoebe beside him, plotting points on a graph. What different images they'd kept from those few years. The bed she and Michael shared, their passionate absorption in astronomy, and their companionable hours of work were invisible to Sam, who remembered only what he saw and heard and what had to do with him. In the dimly lit room where they worked after supper, Sam sat on Phoebe's chair, his back snugged against her side, tightly held by her left arm. But it was Michael, concentrating fiercely, whom he faced, and whose smile lit Sam's eyes. So too had he faced the student visiting from England, a young man with an odd gait, who delighted in clowning and liked chanting nursery rhymes to Sam. Tweedledum and Tweedledee, that was Owen, acting out bits from Through the Looking Glass, while she calculated results from the data he and Michael had gathered. Owen was at Cambridge now, a rising young astrophysicist with everything before him, whereas she, at least he was polite about her work. Books and articles for the interested ignorant, astronomy for the young, eclipses for everyone, mingling what she hoped were sufficient facts with artful descriptions and homely analogies designed to take the place of the mathematics she loved but knew her readers couldn't understand. The Milky Way is shaped like a biscuit. A nebula is like a cloud on the verge of condensing into rain. Donkey work, requiring a certain gift, but not, despite what Owen was polite enough to pretend, a valuable one. She pushed herself to try something new each time. For her latest, The Universe Around Us, she'd promised her publisher a clear and interesting version of the complicated material often mauled in popular accounts. Until recently, when she'd begun this difficult chapter on gravitation and the ether of space, she'd thought it was going well. She turned back to Owen's letter, struck again by that image of Sir Oliver Lodge bolting from the meeting. Only a few days earlier, she'd seen an article about him in the newspaper. He was on a ship from London to New York, about to begin a big lecture tour. Some of the talks were already sold out, which wasn't surprising. Unusually for such an eminent scientist, Lodge liked to write for those who had no scientific training, and she'd sometimes turn to his books for help. Remembering that a list of lecture dates had appeared in the article, Phoebe rummaged through the stack by the fireplace until she found the right paper. On the evening of Lodge's scheduled talk, a crowd snaked out between the tall arches of the Academy of Music and she learned that she'd made up her mind too late. Every seat was sold. Reluctantly, she bought a standing room ticket and entered the stream, carried up the stairs and then up again to one of the galleries on the second tier, where she came to rest behind two women pressed against a fluted column. "You can fit in here," the first woman said, moving her purse to make room. "It's Phoebe, isn't it?" said the second. Her nostrils faced more out than down, giving her otherwise pleasant face a slightly pig-like air. "Odette," she continued, tapping her chunky throat. "Your mother's friend?" "Of course," Phoebe murmured. One of the scores of well-meaning women who served with her mother on committees to educate the children of China or feed those starving in the Balkans. Too many to keep straight. They cheered her decision to go to college, been delighted when she got her job in Washington, tried to conceal their disappointment when she married young and promptly had Sam. "There he is," the first woman said. Phoebe craned her head, but could see the famous old physicist only in snippets. One long leg, one big hand. He was enormously tall. A sliver of his forehead gleamed in the light of the chandelier before a woman's hat eclipsed it. He would speak, he said, he had a fine voice, on the reality of the unseen. She missed his introduction. His words floated up through the horseshoe-shaped tiers, interrupted when the crowd murmured or shifted in their seats, obliterated entirely when Odette whispered to her friend. There were things known to be real, Lodge said, but impossible to see. Atoms, for example, molecules. She strained to hear, hoping he'd describe the invisible but omnipresent ether. Instead, she caught something about the vast distances between the stars and the contrast between that and the minuteness of the atomic world, also unseen, but also real. After a lost chunk that must have contained a vital transition, she heard next a sentence about the reality of mental events, such as thoughts and feelings, which were also invisible. She peered through a crack between the two women's necks. Likewise, Lodge said just then, the human personality survives death in a form we cannot see, but which makes communication after death possible. She pulled her head back and jammed her hands into her coat pockets. What kind of science was this? She knew he was interested in psychical research. He was as famous for this, in circles she avoided completely, as he was for his work on the ether and electromagnetic waves. But she'd assumed his lecture would be about physics. Instead, he was explaining how great discoveries in science have reversed the evidence of the senses. The earth is not flat, but round, and it is not static, but whirls through space at inconceivable speeds. So too will we come to reverse the evidence of our senses with regard to death. Psychic research, the youngest science, like astronomy, deals with phenomena that cannot be examined in the laboratory. Still, theories can be tested and refined over time. Science will eventually prove the existence, all around us, of former humans. They are not far from us. We are all one family still. To the mothers of boys lost in the war, I would say that they are only separated from us by a veil of sense. In front of her, both women sighed, and Phoebe remembered that Odette's son had gone overseas to drive an ambulance. Had he returned? All around her, the audience, mostly women, she now realized, listened raptly, while Odette reached back to touch Phoebe's arm, as if they had something in common. We should not exalt the senses, Lodge continued. Phoebe drew her arm away. They have been developed through the necessity for the physical survival of the fittest. But if we did not dedicate ourselves so completely to the daily work of keeping our bodies alive, what organs of spiritual comprehension might we not develop? The space that separates you, he stretched one hand toward the audience, from me, he pressed that hand to his chest, is not empty. It is the purveyor of light, of electricity, of magnetism, and it may well contain our immortal souls, which persist after matter has disintegrated. She stepped back before she understood that she was going to, ignored Odette's startled face, and pushed her way through the bodies and down the stairs. Wrong, wrong, wrong. She hated when people spoke of communication with the dead, and it was worse when a scientist did so. Rappings and knockings, scribblings on slates, ectoplasm and all the rest, ancient history, half a century old, most already proven fraudulent, and the rest fit only for parlor games, but still strangely persistent. When those superstitions had surfaced again, during the thrilling years when the discoveries of X-ray and radio waves and electrons had made almost anything seem possible, she and Michael had simply ignored them, instead reading eagerly about light as waves, light as photons, energy possessing mass. The space between them, Michael said, was filled with energy, the ground of life itself. The question had been what the ether was. She couldn't imagine what he'd made of the ease by which, once the war began to swallow the young, those left behind were deceived by their resuscitated parlor tricks. By then, left behind herself, she knew exactly how despicable were the turbaned women cracking their joints in code or slipping their feet from specially stiffened shoes to write with their toes on slates. In 1909, not long after Owen returned to England, Michael had welcomed into the observatory a little boy who turned out to have measles. The boy recovered, but Michael's fever soared higher and higher until the morning he closed his eyes and sighed and stopped, just stopped. In that instant, she'd known she would never talk to him again. The lobby stank of face powder. Phoebe pushed through the doors and into the street, where the snow flickered in the electric lights, and a cat streaked by with something squirming in her clamped jaws. Michael had wanted to show off the wonders of the universe, and now she was walking so fast that her cheeks were hot, and a woman in a short skirt stared at her. Now, because a boy had given him measles, because she had a boy of her own to raise, the church bells chimed the hour, he'd be doing his homework, because despite working all the time, she couldn't save enough to buy a house of her own. She was, at the age of 41, living with her elderly parents, and still, despite having published 3 books and innumerable magazine articles, orbiting so far from the center of the scientific world that she must turn to others for explanations that would, when included in her book, lend it the air of authority she lacked herself. She must go to a lecture where, instead of learning what was needed, she was forced again to confront the unalterable fact of Michael's death. I was astonished, she wrote to Owen a few days later, not to mention disappointed. How does a man like him, a man who has spent his entire life thinking and writing about physics, end up like this? One thing to bolt from your meeting. Einstein's theories are so abstract that I sometimes wonder if anyone really understands them. But to refuse to accept them on the basis of insufficient proof, while at the same time contending that the survival of human personality has been proved, how does this make sense? The crowd was enormous, though, and seemed to glide right over the holes in his logic. What, she thought, as she took a new sheet of paper, would Owen have made of that talk? He'd been fresh out of university when he came to Washington, a slim boy with a high forehead, a club foot, and a calm faith in the triumph of true science. Not once had he acted surprised by her mathematical skills or questioned her ability to help him and Michael. He'd been Michael's protege, not hers, but she'd come to think of him as a friend and an equal, and still considered him her one stalwart colleague, although they hadn't seen each other since before Michael's death, and she could no longer picture his face. Always almost always, he responded to her letters. Always, courteously, he asked about her son, although she knew he envisioned not this Sam, but the eager, open toddler of their days in Washington. Sam's hair had been blonde then, wisping pale curls she could never keep parted, no more like the springy auburn mat he now hid behind, than her own sandy dullness was like the shiny chestnut waves Michael had loved. But then Owen himself might be halfway bald, no longer thin, perhaps with a stoop, still with a limp. Wouldn't he have told her if he'd had his foot repaired? Maybe not. Ideas connected them, mathematical symbols and diagrams, a disembodied thread of thought divorced from their daily lives. When she wrote him, she shaped her letters around pleasant anecdotes. 3 days of heavy rain trapped her inside. On the 4th day, a front blew through and cleared the air as completely as if a giant hand had sponged it dry. That night, very late, after everyone was asleep, Phoebe went outside and lay down on the flagstones bordering her mother's garden. Late March, the ground alive despite the cold air. There were the stars circling above. There were the stars, brilliant, blazing, bright against blackness, as beautiful as when she'd first stared at them so many years ago. White, blue, yellow, red. Once she'd gotten serious about the work to which the stars had drawn her, she hardly ever looked at them. She studied their motions, not them. When did she look at the sky anymore? Months passed when night met her yard, her street, a few blocks of Philadelphia, everywhere people, everywhere lights. Now the lights were out, there was no one around. With her back pressed against the stones, she smelled dirt and leaves and budding trees. Branches fringed her view of the sky, which was speckled everywhere. And wasn't it remarkable, really, that she should see the stars at all? Inconceivably far away, emitting light that traveled and traveled. How? Through what? And fell upon her optic nerves to form a picture in her brain. Stars. She felt herself falling up into them, a feeling she remembered from her childhood. The space between her and the stars was infinite or nothing at all. It was empty or it was completely filled. It was. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Learning to read a poet. That seems to me both the easiest and most difficult of tasks. There are poets we cleave to instantly, and others who we approach with wariness, as if their poems are made of alien matter or wrapped in barbed wire, either of which might snare, rebuke, or wound us. In some ways, these difficult poets, the ones we find difficult, quickly teach us more because we have to find our way, have to kind of buck up, ready ourselves for the task of receiving the poem. The poets we navigate, that we naturally gravitate toward, gratify us easily. And so we might not initially spend as much time figuring out how the thing's made, how they've made that hair raise on the back of our necks. Why would we? We're happy to be moved, happy to be swayed by the mystery and the beauty of another consciousness that seems closely twined to our own. Such was my early experience with the poems of Carolyn Forche. With her first 2 books, Gathering the Tribes and The Country Between Us, I didn't have to spend too much time noticing how the poems were made because I found myself happily, thrillingly reading poems to which I instantly felt intimate. How do I love thee? I didn't need to spend a minute figuring out how she made me feel the way I felt reading her poems. When the poems swerved, I swerved. Political, tender, yet simultaneously fierce, complexly female, a daughter, a friend, a lover, engaged, interested, curious, trying to see, trying to listen. I was initially content to just relate. To admire the stance of the poet, the speaker in these poems seemed like someone I just want as a friend. I was a young reader then, when I first encountered the poems of Forche. Gathering the Tribes was published when I was 17 and entering college, the country between us the year after I graduated. I was a hungry, young visual artist just finding her way to poetry. I'd hardly read enough to know anything. I'd hardly thought to slow down enough to think about how a thing was made. I was simply glad to get it. But luckily, I was learning that many of the poems I read, I had to come at slowly and had to allow myself this slowness and enough slogging through poems so that they'd suddenly lift into a new, brilliant, shimmery brilliance. I'd begun to see that allowing oneself to be dumb before a text had its rewards. I learned that not wanting to quickly prove my intelligence, my get it, allowed a deeper entry into a work of art. It made me turn myself back to the poems and the poets I'd more easily read and see how they did what they did and then see if it stuck. And so I returned to the poems of Forche. I went back to the country between us, but also by then there'd been The Angel of History, a radical departure from that earlier work, and later Blue Hour, which extended Forche's range. And when I began to look, I began to appreciate the way Carolyn Forche moved inside a poem, the startling movement of the lens in her poem, the way life narrows at the shuffle of traffic confined to a window, and the way time moved inside that same poem so that if we're lucky, we stand at the window to watch myself at 20, and even now the house is etched on the hard black air where it had been. When I learned to slow down and consider time in her poem, the constant shifting ocular and spatial vision of this poet, I began to hear the density of the lyric movement in her poem, so that in the later poem, Blue Hour, the title of that fourth book, the moon slips from its cerement and my son, already disappearing into a man, moves toward his bed for the night, wrapped in a towel of lake scent. A viola, night-voiced, calls into its past, but nothing comes. Wow. When I stopped reading for the personality of the I in Forche, I discovered the layering of the voice, the voices, the press, and the pressure of the inhabitants, both within the poet and those and the living and dead with which he is in constant conversation. And then I began to hear how these poems loved the world, that thinginess, the nouns she holds sometimes like talismans, sometimes like shards of a lost world, the salvaged and obdurate houses, firs, and rivers, all the names, the elegiac recounting of the dead. And unlike the reader I was 35 years ago, the reader I've been in these weeks before coming to Saratoga and this evening introducing Carolyn Forche, I've found myself most intimately now and thrillingly compelled in Forche's work by the business of her syntax. And in particular, her considerable management of what we would mostly consider all the little words, the and, the it, and most interestingly for me, her use of prepositions within poems. What does it say that in the country between us, half the poems begin with prepositions? Prepositions indicate a relation between things in a sentence, in a room, in borders, in countries, between people. toward, under, beyond, from, over, through, into, within. These aren't small words. Forche knows this. In the first poem of her new beautiful book, a book whose title incidentally begins prepositionally in the lateness of the world, she says, "Nothing but happiness as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light, always be without ships." Forche's little words speak to big relationships. Not either or, but and, the accretion of and. It is a refusal on Forche's part to be linear or singular. These small words function as Forche knows when she says, "What one of us lives through, each must, so that this, of which we are part, will know itself." In these prepositions, there's an attention to how one exists, how one moves in relationship not only to what is, but toward what remains, how it remains, mounds up, and is damaged, fragmented, or made whole. In the poem Sequestered Writing, she says, "A language that once sent ravens through firs, the open world from which it came." The more slowly I come to these poems, the more I take myself away from any preconception about what a Forche poem will be. The more engaged I find myself with all of her subjects, of memory, the poet's call to the future, to what Carolyn Forche calls the impulse of the poem to hover in a receptive state of consciousness without intention. How lucky I have been as a reader these years and a poet to have the poems of Carolyn Forche, and how lucky all of us will be this evening.
Thank you. That's a beautiful introduction, Victoria. I want to say that over 20 years ago, Victoria was the one who pointed out the passage in Thesis on the Philosophy of History, Part 9, The Angel of History. So we've come quite a long time together. And I also want to thank Robert and Peggy for this extraordinary 25 years, 17 of which I have shared with you. It's been really... I can't start now, I have to read. My paternal grandmother was from Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, and I wrote my first serious poem in memory of her when I was a very young girl. And ever since then, she has insisted to be in my books. She's been dead since 1968, but she stands behind me sometimes when I'm writing and whispers, "I want to be in the book." So some of you know this, but she had an odd way of speaking English. She spoke several Eastern European languages. Her odd way of speaking English might be illustrated by the fact that she referred to a colander as a macaroni. "Stop, water, go ahead." So this is what I learned from her. I learned that you could play with language a little bit. So the first poem is an invocation for the reading. It's her poem. If I read it, she'll be happy and leave me alone for the rest of the reading. It's called Visitation. On the nativity tree, there is a tiny lute, a French horn and painted egg, a crèche carved from olive wood, a trumpeting angel. The Cossack in his red tunic dances between a bird's nest and some Eiffel towers. In the iced window, it seems as if a cathedral shivers and its bells shower stones as bits of torn cloud float toward the spires. There are also boats sailing in the window, and a city resembling Dresden or Hamburg after the war. Anna is there, crocheting smoke, not speaking English anymore, as if English had put out her memory like a broom on a fire. The snows drift all the way to the roof of the house, so it is no longer possible to open the door. She tells us that on this night, in her village, they would carry home a live carp wrapped in paper that had just been swimming in a barrel. The fish would silver the snow and have its life taken by a sharp axe. The potatoes that had grown eyes in the cellar would be brought up and baked with the fish, and there would be beet soup, black bread, and wine made from mulberries. Something would be given to each of them, a thing they wanted but didn't need. And then they would sleep as if in a boat at sea with the bright carp swimming through the snow of their thoughts. Then she was off, tunneling through the drifts as only a spirit could tunnel, leaving behind a coin purse, a crystal brooch, a holy card with her own birth and death dates, so we would know that she hadn't visited us, that her satin-pillowed coffin lay still in the ground. Nevertheless, the tinsel flickered as she passed. The tiny lighthouse sent its signal to the boats, and the sheep bounded away over the fir branch tufted with wool, and in every glass bulb there we were, children descended from her on a winter night, to whom she taught the past, to whom she gave a present. This is for a friend who lived through the siege of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Letter to a city under siege. Turning the pages of the book you have lent me of your wounded city, reading the braille of its walls, walking beneath ghost branches of chestnuts, past fires that turned the shattered windows bronze, flaring an instant without warming the fallen houses, where you sleep without water or light, a biscuit tin between you, and later in the cafe ruins, discussing all night the burnt literature borrowed from a library where all books met with despair. I wanted to give your notes back to you, so they might be published in another language, not yours or mine, but a tongue understood by children who make bulletproof vests out of cardboard. We could then lie down in the cemetery, where violets grew in your childhood, before snipers fired on the city using gravestones for cover. Friend, absent one, exile, I can tell you that your tunnel is still there, mud-walled and hollowed of earth, through which you smuggled oranges into the city, oranges bright as winter moons by the barrow load. So let's walk further up the street, to the hill where we see the city woven in fog, roofs filled with sky, uprooted bridges, and a shop window where a shard of glass hangs over the spine of a book. The library burns on page 60, as it burns in all the newspapers of the world. And the clopping of horses' hooves isn't the sound of clopping horses. This is where, through snow, a dog finds his way within its mouth a human bone. Quiet are the ruins of the houses of God. All the houses. And what else? What more? No food, no light, no water. Even clocks aren't spared. But, my good friend, the tunnel, the oranges. Some of you might remember Ilya Kaminsky from his time here. He started at the New York State Summer Writers Institute workshops when he was about 19 years old. I think some of you, I don't know whether you were here then, but you know how we all introduce ourselves at the beginning of the workshop and tell something about our lives and how we're coming back to poetry and how long it's been since we were able to write. And everyone introduced themselves, and at the very end, Ilya gets up with his 2 big hearing aids in his ears, beautiful, tall Ilya, and says the following: "My name is Ilya Kaminsky. I am from Odessa, former Soviet Union. I write poetry for God." So that's how we started workshop that summer. Okay, class, let's start the poems. So Ilya now is Ilya Kaminsky, who has written Dancing in Odessa, and many of you have maybe seen him read. We went back together to Odessa now some years ago. This is a poem for him. Exile. The city of your childhood rises between steppe and sea, wheat and light. White with the dust of cockle shells, stargazers, and bones of pipefish. City of limestone soft enough to cut with a hatchet, where the sea unfurls and acacias brought by Greeks on their ships turn white in summer. So yes, you remember, this is the city you lost. City of smugglers and violinists, chess players and monkeys. An opera house, a madhouse, a ghost church with wind for its choir, where 2 things were esteemed: literature and ships, poetry and the sea. If you return now, it will not be as a being visible to others. And when you walk past, it will not be as if a man had passed, but rather as if someone had remembered something long forgotten and wondered why. If you return, your father will be alive to prepare for you his mint cucumber soup, or give you the little sweet called bird's milk. And after hours of looking with him for his sandals lost near the sea, you visit again the amusement park where your ancestors are buried, and then go home to the apartment house built by German prisoners of war to whom your father gave bread, which you remember surprised you. You take the tram to a stop where it is no longer possible to get off. And he walks with you until he vanishes, still holding in his own your invisible hand. And this is for my friend Daniel Simko, author of a book called The Arrival, which was published posthumously. Daniel was an unknown poet who wouldn't send his work out. He was very stubborn, but he was also a wonderful translator of Georg Trakl. And the book is Autumn Sonata, the Trakl poems. He was a librarian at the New York Public. And he was also from former Czechoslovakia. And when the Velvet Revolution came, Daniel insisted that we go back for him, there for me, to Bratislava, where he had hidden all of his jazz records and books and blue jeans and things in an attic. But they had been there for 22 years, so you can imagine the condition of the jazz records. But he had this idea that he was going, and I wanted to find the parts of my family that were still there. So we went, and we used to have suitcases with no wheels on them. Some of you may remember that. I don't know why we didn't think of putting wheels on suitcases in the past, but they were also very big and very heavy, so we had to lug them around, and he had 2 of them, and, well, this is what happened to one of them. This is the lost suitcase. So it was with the suitcase left in front of the hotel. Cinched, broken locked, papered with world ports. Carrying what mattered until then, until turning your back to cup a match, it was taken, and the thief, expecting valuables, instead found books written between wars. Gold attic light, mechanical birds singing, and the chronicle of your country's final hours. What, by means of notes, you hoped to become? A noun on paper. Paper dark with nouns. Swallows darting through a basilica, your hands up in smoke. A cloud about to open over the city, pillows breathing shallowly where you had lain, a ghost in a hospital gown, and here your voice, principled, tender, soughing through a fence woven with pine boughs. Writing is older than glass, but younger than music. Older than clocks or porcelain, but younger than rope. Dear one who even in speaking is silent, for years I have searched, usually while asleep, when I have found the suitcase open, collecting snow, still holding your vademecum of the infinite, your dictionary of the no longer spoken, a commonplace of wounds casually inflicted, and the slender ledger of truly heroic acts. Gone is your atlas of countries unmarked by war, absent your manual for the preservation of ours. The incunabulum is lost, both your earliest book and a hatching place for your mechanical birds, but the collection of aperçus having to do with light laying its eggs in your eyes was found, along with the prophecy that all mass murders were early omens. In an antique bookshop I found your Catechism of Atrophied Faiths, so I lay you to rest without your psalter, nor the monograph wherein you state your most unequivocal and hard-won proposition, that everything must happen, but to whom doesn't matter. Here are your books as if they were burning. Be near now and wake to tell me who you were. This is a new poem. It's also it's also an elegy. And it begins with an epigraph by René Char. In English it is, "To the silence of the one who sets us dreaming." It's called Travel Papers. By boat to Surah-Sarai, where the small fish were called vandas. A man blew a horn of birch wood toward the nightless sea. Still voice, fire that is no fire. Ahead, years unknown to be lived. Bells from the tower in the all at once, then one by one, hours. Outside, so fleetingly, ourselves. In a still mirror, in the blue within, where this earthly journey dreaming itself begins. Thought into being from the hidden to the end of the visible. Mountains before and behind, heather and lichen, yarrow, gorse, then a sea village of chartreuse fronds, spent fuel, burnt wind, mute swans. We drove the birch-lined highway from Dresden to Berlin, behind armored cars in late afternoon, 19th of June, passing the black cloud of a freight truck from Budapest, through disappearing villages, past horses grazing vanished fields. The year before you died, America went to war again on the other side of the world. This is how the earth becomes, you said, a grotto of skeletons. In the ruins of a station, a soaked bed, broken chairs, a dead coal stove, white weather, chalk and basalt, puffins, fuchsia, and history shot through with particles of recognition. This one, wetted down with petrol, then set alight. That one, taking 40 rounds. This other, found 11 years later in a bog. In the station house, imaginary maps, smoke chased by wind, a registry of arrivals, the logs of ghost ships, and a few prison diaries written on tissue paper. Do you remember the blue-leaved lilies, the grotto, the hoarfrost, the freeze? Through the casements of glass hand blown before the war, a birch tree let snow drop through its limbs onto other birches. Birch twigs in wind through glass. Who were we then? Such a laughter as morning peeled its light from us. You said the cemeteries were full, in a voice like wind plaiting willows. Fields in bloom, but silent, without grasshoppers or bees. What do you want then? You with your neverness, your unknown, your book of things, you with wants years ahead to be lived. Your father believes he took you with him, that you are in an urn beside your sleeping mother, but I am still writing with your hand. As you stand in your still there of lighted words. Such is the piano's sadness and the rifle's moonlight. Stairwells remember, as do doors, but windows do not. Do not upon waking gaze out a window if you wish to remember your dream. An ache of hope that you will come back. The cawing flock is not your coming. Did you float toward Salzburg, a wind in the mustard fields, or walk instead beside me through the asylum in Krakow? Hours after your death, you seemed everywhere at once, like the swifts at twilight. Now your moments are clouds in a photograph of swifts. In the hour held open between day and night, under the meteor showers of Perseid, we held each other for the last time. Dead, you whispered, where is the road? There, through the last of the sentences, just there, through the last of the sentences, the road. A bridge. We're now going to Ireland. There's a little journey embedded in here, and because I'm at the New York State Summer Writers Institute, and I've been here for 17 years, and because when I look up, I see people from different parts of my life who came tonight, I think I will just say that I'm celebrating something this week, which is my 5th year of survival from cancer, and one of the people who helped me is in this poem, and a lot of people in this room too. And this means I have become the happy state of being statistically negligible. So now I'm like other people again, I hope. This is called A Bridge. Behind us, a sea cliff, landfall, ahead the wind, tar smoke, the sea, a carrack. We sway on a bridge between them above a great shattering. We have left the verge, our certainty, and walk across a chasm to the cries of cormorants, fulmars, the wings of mute swans singing in flight. Below us, bladderwrack, sea froth and dulse, sea against rocks in heave and salt, and between bridge and sea an abyss we cross as behind us the headland recedes. Cottages and boats, clouds and sheep, a piping of oyster catchers dying out, and the calling of kittiwake preparing to leave their nesting ground. The bridge rises and falls with our steps, moving in wind, so we must hold fast the ropes, once made of hides and the hair of cows' tails, hoisted over the silvering salmon as they leapt into bag nets, too heavy to lift, hauled across this very bridge that rings in wind like ship's rigging, volery of rock pipits, bazaar of guillemots, colony of puffins, and in the blackest water below us, ghosts of salmon, empty nests, and on the Carrick, ruins of boats, nets, buoys, and fishermen's bothy. We have only to keep walking for the bridge to go on. The Carrick is a foothold in the distance, a stone in time. When we reach it, not only may the salmon return, but you will be alive again. Wake me when we reach the Carrick. This is the Museum of Stones. Maybe some of you collect stones. I collect them from all over the place. I had this friend who used to label them and put them in a neat little museum. And the stones would have their city or country or where they were picked up from. And I started doing it, only mine are all in brown paper bags and they're all mixed up because I didn't label them. So they're very important stones from all over the world, but they're just a pile of stones instead of a museum. So I have to tell you something. I went and walked up at the Acropolis this past month, and you're not supposed to take any stones away from the Acropolis. But I was thinking about it the whole time, how much I wanted a little stone from the Acropolis. So when I got down to the bottom, I picked up a piece of gravel, and I will just label that one. That will be the one I label the Acropolis. So this is the Museum of Stones, and it's a cheap way to have souvenirs, by the way. And when they lift up your suitcase to weigh it when you come home, they say things like, "What do you have, rocks in here?" And you get to say yes. The Museum of Stones. These are your stones, assembled in matchbox and tin, collected from roadside, culvert and viaduct, battlefield, threshing floor, basilica, abattoir. Stones loosened by tanks in the streets from a city whose earliest map was drawn in ink on linen. Schoolyard stones in the hand of a corpse. Pebbles from Baudelaire's SWI. Stone of the mind within us carried from one silence to another. Stone of cromlech and cairn, schist and shale, hornblende, agate, marble, millstones, ruins of choirs and shipyards, chalk, marl, mudstone from temples and tombs. Stone from the silvery grass near the scaffold. Stone from the tunnel lined with bones. Lava of a city's entombment. Stones chipped from lighthouse, cell wall, scriptorium, paving stones from the hands of those who rose against the army. Stones where the bells had fallen, where the bridges were blown. Those that had flown through windows, weighted petitions, feldspar, rose quartz, blue schist, Nice and Chert. Fragments of an abbey at dusk. Sandstone toe of a Buddha, mortared at Bamiyan. Stone from the hill of 3 crosses and a crypt. From a chimney where storks cried like human children. Stones newly fallen from stars. A stillness of stones, a heart, altar and boundary stone, marker and vessel, first cast, load and hail, bridge stones and others to pave and shut up with, stone apple, stone basil, beech berry, stone brake, stone bramble, stone fern, lichen, liverwort, pippin and root. Concretion of the body, as blind, as cold, as deaf. All earth a quarry, all life a labor, stone-faced, stone drunk with hope that this assemblage of rubble taken together would become a shrine or holy place, an ossuary, immovable and sacred, like the stone that marked the path of the sun as it entered the human dawn. Litany in Krakow. The yes of the living, the no of the wall, the yes of the bridge, the no of the water below the bridge, the yes of wind, no of wire, the yes of bell, walls, the no of the bolted door, the yes of air, the no of answer, the yes of swallows, the no of stone. The Refuge of Art, epigraph from Nabokov. I am thinking of RX and angels, the secret of durable pigments, the refuge of art. In an atelier that was once a shoe factory, an artist paints walls, cromlechs and cairns with pigmented stone dust, dolmens with markings from an unknown past, horses chiseled in chalk on bluestone, a huntsman's frieze in Paleolithic time. Slate tiles light his vigil over stags in flight, bison stampeding, wild oryx with lyre-shaped horns, horses galloping his walls, and upon them serpent spirals, lozenges, and stars. In the dawn of humanity, children built passage tombs for the dead, stone hives in earth for the hum of spirit. At solstice, sunlight enters their chambers precisely for 17 minutes. Some years also the moon. Over the tombs fly the wintering swans as stars hiss out. In these hollow pits they repose, their bones whitening in utter dark where not even bats sing. These tombs were secret for millennia, until seen from the air, round and risen in the calm-tilled fields. This was during the Great War, when small planes banged through the clouds toward Europe. For the first time, pilots saw jeweled cities, a bracelet of bridge lights, chess villages, quilts of crops and snake of rivers, snow wounded by wire, smokestacks of cloud, but nothing that was seen before. And after the war, these pilots led civil engineers to the fields of the great round domes. No one knew what these were at first. Nothing was known. Not that the builders would have been children to us. Not why they spent their lives moving stones so the sun might slip through a fissure of light between them at dawn on a winter night. The symbols on the walls are indecipherable, and it is not known why the artist paints them. He himself doesn't know, standing as he does in a slate blindness. Only that with time he might read a message regarding wild oryx, bison and spirals, stars and lozenges, calling him to a former shoe factory that has become, in the early 21st century, a refuge of art. The end of something. We ate our lunch under the lindens. Figs were last. The lemons were nearly ripe, hanging like ornaments from the lemon branch. This isn't our last day, she said. Tomorrow is our last day. As proof, she offered time singing in the olives. There was a field of poppies nearby. After the Second War, only one bridge remained. People crowd upon it. We were trying to climb to the ruins when my heart gave way. When my heart gave way in the poppy field, I had to turn back. Before turning back, I pressed a few poppies in a book. Before turning back, I also took a photograph of no one standing in the poppy field. I was myself standing. I asked my mother, thousands of miles away, to help me back to the house. If you are still reading this, I am flooded with peace. Morning on the island. The lights across the water are the waking city. The water shimmers with imaginary fish. Not far from here lie the bones of conifers washed from the sea and piled by wind. Some mornings I walk upon them, bone to bone, as far as the lighthouse. A strange beetle has eaten most of the trees. It may have come here on the ships playing music in the harbor, or it was always here, a winged jewel, but in the past was kept still by the cold of a winter that no longer comes. There is an owl living in the firs behind us, but he is white, meant to be mistaken for snow burdening a bough. They say he is the only owl remaining. I hear him at night, listening for the last of the mice, and asking, who of no other owl? Some of you know that I worked in El Salvador between 1978 and 1980. And in the poem, The Colonel, there is the mention of a friend. In the poem, the friend is anonymous. He is the friend who tells me with his eyes to say nothing. And this friend can now be named. He is Leonel Gomez Vides, was Leonel Gomez Vides. He was my mentor and guide and friend for 30 years, and he died in 2009. And it prompted me to think about many things and to go back to El Salvador several times in the past couple of years, and to remember one particular young girl whom I could not get out of my mind, and for 30 years, and I could never speak of her, and she never came to the paper, which is what I call being able to write about something, I guess. Either that comes or it doesn't come to the page, and she never did until after he was dead. And so now I have a poem, and it's called The Ghost of Heaven. And she's here in this poem. And it's now what El Salvador is now for me, the ghost of heaven. Sleep to sleep through 30 years of night. A child, herself with the child, for whom we searched, through here or there, amidst bones still sleeved and trousered, a spine picked clean, a paint can, a skull with hair. Sewn into the hem of memory, fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God not of philosophers or scholars. Night to night, child walking toward me through burning maze, over the clean bones of those whose flesh was lifted by zopilotes into heaven. So that is how we ascend, in the clawed feet of fallen angels, to be assembled again in the workrooms of the clouds. She rose from where they found her lying not far from a water urn, leaving herself behind on the ground, where they found her, holding her arms before her as if she were asleep. That is how she appears to me, a ghost in heaven carrying her arms in her arms. Blue smoke from corn cribs, flap of wings. On the walls of the city streets, a plague of initials. Walking through a fire-lit river to a burning house. Dead singer, sewing machine, and piece of dress. Outside a cashew tree wept blackened cashews over lamina. Outside paper fireflies rose to the stars. Bring penicillin if you can, surgical tape, a whetstone, mosquito repellent, but not the aerosol kind. Especially bring a syringe for sucking phlegm, a knife, wooden sticks, a surgical clamp, and plastic bags. You will need a bottle of cloud for anesthesia. Like the flight of a crane through colorless dreams. When a leech opens your flesh, it leaves a small volcano. Always pour turpentine over your hair before going to sleep. Such experiences as these are forgotten before memory intrudes. The girl was found. Don't say this. With a man's severed head stuffed into her where the child would have been. No one knew who the man was. Another of the dead. So they had not, after all, killed a pregnant girl. This was a relief to them. That sound in the brush, a settling of wind in sorghum. If they capture you, talk. Live one world to another. Talk, please. Yes, you heard me the first time. You will be asked who you are. Eventually, we are all asked who we are. All who come into the world, all who come into the world are sent. Open your curtain of spirit. I'm going to close with a poem called The Light Keeper. And I hope it will be a little bit up from that. I like lighthouses. There are probably a few other lighthouse people in this room. We like to be alone at the lighthouses, but there are always other lighthouse people walking around by the lighthouses, so it's very rare to get to be alone because there are other lighthouse people. This is about the history of one particular lighthouse, which is called Hook. It's on the coast of Ireland, and it's not too far from a lighthouse called Crook. So you see, by hook or by crook, it might be where we got that. I'm not sure. But it's a beautiful lighthouse, and it's still functioning. So this is my close. And thank you for everything, all of you. The Light Keeper. A night without ships. Foghorns called into walled cloud. And you, still alive, drawn to the light as if it were a fire kept by monks. Darkness once crusted with stars, but now death dark as you sail inward. Through wild gorse and sea wrack, through heather and torn wool you ran, pulling me by the hand so I might see this for once in my life. The spin and spin of light, the whirring of it, light in search of the lost, there since the era of fire. Era of candles and hollow wick lamps, whale oil and solid wick, colza and lard, kerosene and carbide, the signal fires lighted on this perilous coast in the Tower of Hook. You say to me, stay awake. Be like the lens maker who died with his lungs full of glass. Be the yew in blossom when bees swarm. Be their amber cathedral, and the ghosts of Cistercians will be kind to you. In a certain light, as after rain, in pearled clouds or the water beyond, seen or sensed water, sea or lake, you would stop still and gaze out for a long time. Also when fireflies opened and closed in the pines and a star appeared, our only heaven. You taught me to live like this, that after death it would be as it was before we were born. Nothing to be afraid, nothing but happiness as unbearable as the dread from which it comes. Go toward the light always. Be without ships. Thank you.